Okay, a few short videos before Tuesday. I'm trying to spend the last weekend with my daughter. The oldest one's overseas, youngest one's here. So I'll make it short. I just want to thank everybody that supported me over the past 5 years, 6 years. Been incredible support around the world, but especially in Australia. Thank you so much. Fantastic donations and beautiful comments. I'll leave a longer video about what else, but that's all I can really say. It's been hard. It's been 11 years. Pushed to my absolute limits. And I certainly would not have made it without the support of the incredible people that I have. So just thank you for that. You know who you are. And I'll do you proud on Tuesday, whatever happens. As I say, I may have broken the law, but I did not break my oath to the Australian people. And I won't let you down in jail. I will stand tall and continue the fight for a better Australia.
So, we have spoken about this stuff before, and why there is a decreasing number in the Defence Force, and why there is no loyalty in a country, and why it's so thin spread. The Australian Defence Force is facing an acute recruitment crisis. Only 80% of the 69,000 personnel needed to meet future challenges have signed up. So they're not able to get to 100% capacity, and the force that they do have signing up is inadequate. So it's acute. Might be a national security issue, right? Might be a severe problem of a sovereign position, right? Not only is the Australian military failing to achieve planned growth, it is actually shrinking, as Defence Chief General Angus Campbell told a Senate inquiry in February. So it's been known about for quite some time, and it's been an ongoing issue which might relate back to the way that the state treats the people in the country. We've seen this whole sovereign citizen ideology for trying to be loyal. We've seen Daniel Andrews assault the people of Victoria in the Victoria markets and at the domain twice, the King's Domain. We've seen Daniel Andrews commit an atrocity across Melbourne. We saw the same in Sydney. So we see this culture across Australia that these silver spooners can just push the people around and then expect the people to just sign up for their wars. And the people have become wise to this game and no longer want to participate in something that has no loyalty or real lineage in it. And we have demonstrated this through 75 years of peacekeeping with a foreign Great Seal, which is the core foundation here at law when we speak of the Constitution. There are two fundamental reasons for the current recruitment impasse. One is economic, low unemployment, and a perception of better opportunities, work conditions, and future prospects in the private sector. The other reason is cultural, a declining willingness of Gen Z to identify with and fight to defend their nation. Either way, the key to the recruitment crisis lies in understanding the motivations of this generation, the main pool of potential recruits today. We recently interviewed 19 serving Australian soldiers from a range of demographics. 2 were Gen Z and across military branches in a study funded by the Australian Defence Force. We wanted to find out what makes Gen Z recruits tick and what the force might do to persuade more of them to serve their country. Persuade. There's a failure and a disconnection in anything that would be loyal, that you would take an oath to in all of this. And the government and its citizenship model full well knows that this is collapsing around them as people realise that that model only serves to use them as debt fodder. This is very demonstrated by the state police and the way the states only use the people for some source of revenue, And there is no loyalty to defend anything when everything is privatised to raise that revenue, So the Australian Defence Force is disconnected, and Chief General Angus Campbell, sitting before a Senate inquiry, hasn't touched on the bastardisation or culture in his command. So when we look at someone willing to lay down their life, as per the stone of remembrance in the King's Domain, John 15:13, why would they do that if they weren't assured that their family and their bloodline would live in peace and harmony on the lands instead of having to deal with Reserve Bank currencies and money masters that push them around as debt fodder for the mere creation of more currency? The sad part here is that they are dubbed the anxious generation by social psychologists based in some sort of mental health service overseen by some US Marine Corps lieutenant who spells it out in his book on Gen Z military recruitment. We've got to brain train these people to be good corporate soldiers for the government of the day that's in a debt machine, that put everything in a corporate sphere and has to follow all of its government policies because it's the government of the day. A military career can be detrimental to psychological well-being, as Australia's Royal Commission into Veteran Suicide has demonstrated. The force's rigorous mental health entry standards may have reinforced this perception. The soldiers we spoke to said mental health is an issue for recruitment. On the one hand, they agreed that service is mentally challenging and that younger soldiers are more psychologically vulnerable. On the other hand, interviewees said the force's mental health support has been improving. This is a step in the right direction. It may well be that media coverage of veterans' mental health issues worries Zoomers considering enlistment. Weiss argues private sector jobs and money afford much more online currency than military service. The respondents in our interviews agreed younger recruits were very savvy about pay and conditions, in this corporation we call the ADF, right? So Weiss argues that more online currency for these Zoomers. So we're working towards paying them in CDBCs, central bank digital currencies. That's all about mental health, because this national government always offers the help for the cause that it created. So you're asking the victim to let the perpetrator give the fix to what the perpetrator did in the first place. This is some sort of psychologically bad relationship, waning national pride, because we forgot that we were united in a federal commonwealth, which had some sort of fabric at law over and above some sort of governance, which could have lied in God, King, and country. And those defence forces would have been serving king and country instead of some sort of government of the day. This would separate the parliament from being able to declare war without any sort of lineage in those forces in the first place. They wouldn't be used as foot soldiers for some sort of corporate governance and then be accused of committing war crimes after a culture was defined in that command. And that command responsibility needs to be held accountable for these failures in that command, where they took over from God, King, and country. And this is probably why there is a waning national pride, is because the likes of Albo have brought a slew of immigration here and played this international game on behalf of some moneylenders instead of looking at the best interests of the country, like some of those smaller European countries that stood up to this immigration crisis that was created in a diaspora of warfare. Our interviewees suggested that if nationalist values motivate Zoomers, this is the only, in terms of doing the right thing, this offers an alternative opportunity for recruiters, the changing role of the military towards peacekeeping and disaster relief makes defence attractive to those with humanitarian values. I'll repeat that because it's probably the most important sentence in this entire document. This offers an alternative opportunity for recruiters because the changing military, right? You're no longer in God, King, and country. You're no longer under some sort of government of the day. You've got some sort of military obligation to the United Nations, which is an employment recruitment opportunity for this changing role towards peacekeeping and disaster relief, which makes the Defence Force an attractive to those with DEI values, like our current Governor-General has pushed upon the people while something else has been going on in the background. So how do we boost our debt fodder? How do we boost the recruitment over a nationality issue where people see a war machine driving them and their families into poverty via things like revenue raising by the state and its police force? How do you recruit people when you slap them around all the time? I don't think they want to be recruited by a nanny government that continued slapping them for 50 plus years. I think they've woken up to the fact that a nanny is in their cookie jar trying to undermine something at the blessing of Almighty God. So when we look at this boost to a recruitment drive, giving the increasing war for talent, right? This corporate war for talent. But they have a great deal to offer the military in a war for talent. They may be the most success-orientated among recent generations. They have an unprecedented ability to handle digital technologies that are becoming increasingly important in the military, like their driverless trucks and their surveillance technologies over their own populations as they turn on their own populations, and then wonder why those populations won't serve them. Many of the proposals to raise military recruitment in Australia are general. The government recently raised pay and bonuses in the Defence Force, for example. Pay and bonuses. I think it's the officers that got those pay rises, because the bonuses kind of puts it in that office sort of commissioned sort of region there where they're covering their asses over their own failure to command, which is very demonstrated by the other content in this very video. So let's move on.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. I rise to talk about leadership, what it means, and what a great leader looks like. While I was jotting some notes down last night, I was thinking about a great Australian military leader, or the leaders that we've had in the past, and I kept coming back to one of our greatest, Sir John Monash. And one of his famous quotes was, and I quote, "Equip yourself for life, not solely for your own benefit, but for the benefit of the whole community," end quote. I wonder what he would think about the leadership of our Australian Defence Force today. I wonder what he would think of an inquiry into alleged war crimes involving Australia's diggers that from the outset ruled out investigating the knowledge or responsibility of the senior command of our military. I wonder what Monash would say about ADF leaders asking for medals back from diggers but marking their own homework when it comes to their own medals. And I wonder what the leadership would think about sending diggers to Afghanistan on tour after tour, sometimes as many as 17 tours, to a war that dragged out for 20 years. Monash was a great leader and always preferred substance over style. Of his time in the First World War, he said, and I quote, "We trusted each other and we fought as one big team, and to this we owe our success. I hope that the lessons of mutual help, comradeship and self-sacrifice will assist to make Australia a still greater country than at present," end quote. Did you hear that from General Angus Campbell? How do you think the diggers under your command in Afghanistan are feeling when their lives are under the microscope, but their leaders are effectively saying, "Nothing to see here, we're exempt from being looked at"? I've ranted and sometimes raved and kept at the shocking lack of leadership and wept at the shocking lack of leadership in defence for years. It's why I fought so hard to get into Parliament. I experienced firsthand the lack of respect for those who have served and the Department of Veterans Affairs, their default system. Delay, deny, die is the order of the day. Why do you think we have historically low recruitment and retention rates? Why do you think we have record numbers of suicide and abuse claims that literally take years to be resolved? It's about the leadership and the culture that flows from leaders who don't take responsibility for their actions or lack of, and don't look after their diggers. In the face of these facts and the disgraceful stories coming out of the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide, it is shocking to me that the Australian Government is refusing to acknowledge the poor leadership in the upper ranks of our Defence Force. Everyone in the chain of command must be held accountable, no matter how many medals they have and how many years they've served. That is the way it is. Let me tell you how they teach it. It's one in all in uniform. You're part of the division that's going on in there between the diggers and the officers. We have never needed our Defence Force more, and it is absolutely crucial that it is an institution that attracts the young leaders of tomorrow. If we want to build a Defence Force that young Australians aspire to join, a Defence Force that cares as much for the digger as the commander, then the failures of leadership and the deep culture of problems that we have must be acknowledged and must be addressed. I can assure you, right now you have a problem, and this is your big problem, and until you start admitting this, the government of the day starts admitting we have a problem with our leadership. Your retention rate Your retention rate will continue to go up and nobody out there wants to join. That is where you're at. This is not good for national security. This is not good for our military. You've got to stop avoiding this. You've got to start asking those generals questions. You've got to stop exempting them. Right now, I can tell you the amount of hatred coming from diggers towards the generals and this parliament, because you won't take on those generals, that is coming at us. It is coming in, I tell you what, it is coming in truckloads. It is awful. You do not want this going on in our military. We are ultimately in charge, and the government of the day is in charge, not those generals. And you need to show some courage as part of the government. Your defence minister, not the one in charge of the personnel, but your big defence minister. You've got to stop hiding, mate, because your time's up. I can tell you what, I know what's coming in the next week, and your time is over, and so are those generals.
Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. I rise to address this matter of urgency. I won't be supporting it, but I would like to address particularly the line where it talks about people in command being held accountable for their actions. And I think accountability is incredibly important, and I recognise Senator Lambie's passion around these issues, but it actually goes far broader than that. If we are looking to the security of this nation.
The national security of this nation. So when we look at the Defence Force, and we've just heard some very harsh words from Jackie Lambie, she's very rightful to do so, given that these are war crimes that we are talking about here. But we can see in this administration, under these Hague and Geneva Conventions, as well as the rules of usufruct, we can see all of these corporate values that are held by this Defence Force. This is what we've just demonstrated to be a peacekeeping force instead of a royal military force. Under the APS Code of Conduct, we are obliged to behave at all times in a way that upholds the APS values and employment principles. And the integrity and good reputation of our agency and the APS. All APS employees' behaviour outside work, including online, is subject to the Code of Conduct in our corporation, our agency. And this is important. 1, it could reasonably be viewed as failing to uphold the integrity and good reputation of the employee's agency. 2, it could reasonably call into question the employee's capacity to comply with the values and the employment principles in their work. It's not a duty, it's work. It's not a duty, it's work. You wouldn't be told like this what to do as the fathers of your estates who gathered to create this constitution, which put these politicians in a limitation of parliament. And here they are treating you like you are a corporation with all of these corporate values and a code of conduct as employees of this agency of some larger employer. The Australian Defence Force has a convention of non-partisanship for members of the force. This requires ADF members, when carrying out their official duties, to be politically neutral and obedient to lawful direction from the government of the day. And this is where Jackie Lambie just mentioned that government of the day. And we have a lack here from God, King, those king's men defending a border so that a government could govern. Here we have that government treating those men like the servants instead of being the public servants of those fathers in Father's house.
But when you look at what is happening at the moment, it gives me cause to think, is it a good option for somebody to do that, knowing that at any point you could be injured, leave, and not be supported in a way that is expected and that you should be supported because you have chosen to serve. So from my perspective at the moment, it would take serious consideration before you would be advising people to do that. And I say that it could change very quickly because it's all about the leadership.
This leadership has forgotten you. This leadership has put together a ceremony for a changeover or a literal takeover. They have denied you, as naked owners of your Constitution and Royal Australian men, your lineage to carry on in the image of your forefathers, in the name that you are as royal, in the name that you are as Australian, in the name that you are in your colours issued to you by the Anglican Church in Canberra. Do you see any of your faith before this handover here happening before our very eyes? Do you see an Aboriginal Defence Force? Do you see Aboriginal sovereignty? Or do you see a Royal Australian Regiment, its men, its lineage in its fathers, its knowing and standing in God, King and country? Do you see a lineage in your ancestry and your rights as a people who have spilt blood across battlefields across the world to uphold that very right, as demonstrated in the previous video speaking about Trump's speech?
I've just been boxing. I've still got my wraps on to show you that I'm genuine. I might go back out there and do a bit more. It seems clear, and I know he's got his defenders, but when Scott Morrison was Prime Minister, he took a number of questionable pieces of paper to David Hurley, and David Hurley signed them. He didn't get a second opinion, and I guess on his side of the story was he was doing it to help the government achieve its ends efficiently. Now, one of the important things about it is that Hurley kept it secret. Normally, he has a photo opportunity, shaking the hands of the Prime Minister, signing the letter in front of the portrait of the Queen. He didn't do that on this occasion. Now, I think as a barrister, that would be the key evidence that there was some sort of guilty mind. Nobody spoke about it. And even the ministers who'd been undermined didn't know. Now, that's suspicious. You might keep things secret from the public, maybe, but keeping it secret from the ministers, they have all the clearances that they need.
Could we say that we were the thorn in Scott Morrison's side, and that we stood up and consecrated a flag, and that we stood in lineage of our Anzac, and that we stood in defiance of this changeover that was happening behind closed doors? And could it be that I'm speaking very loudly about all those things and what led to those things over 20 years? Why am I ignored in this matter when it seems that everything that we have done as a people has caused many of these things to go behind closed doors as they went into sovereign citizen mode and tried to attack all of you?
Doesn't make sense. Now, what does this say about David Hurley? A lot of people have said to me, don't attack David Hurley, everybody likes him. He's a kind of grandfather figure. He looks a bit like Father Christmas. He's a Christian. Sure, I get all that. But what people don't realise about Hurley, I think he was worse than even the allegations against Ben Roberts-Smith. Hurley was an officer, remember. He was the Chief of the Defence Force and the Chief of Army before that. I read all the secret documents, all of them, about Hurley and what went on behind the scenes. And I can tell you this, never once did I see David Hurley stick up for the soldiers. Not once. Now that is a key principle. It's perhaps the only key principle as an officer. Obviously, you can send soldiers to their deaths. It's a hard job, but you can never bullshit them and you can never run them down and you can never sacrifice them for political goals. Now, Hurley thought nothing of doing whatever the minister wanted. No one believed me, but it was a very destructive thing for the Australian Defence Force. He wasn't alone. Binskin was no better. Binskin was probably worse, but Binskin, you could let Binskin off because I don't think he even understood. I'll leave him, but Hurley knew better. And so I think this is quite important. Now, why I think it is so important, as I've said, my theory is, and Andrew Hastie has confirmed, that he complained about Ben Roberts-Smith in 2012, 2013, and he complained to a senior guy, the Regimental Sergeant Major of the SAS Regiment. Now, not everybody knows how the system works in the military. It's pretty complicated, but the Regimental Sergeant Major of 22 SAS, or SASR, sorry, as they're called here, is a very important guy. Now, it's impossible to think that he did not, even socially, that he did not speak to another RSM, his more senior counterpart, who is the RSM of Special Operations Command. The two people, normally one follows the other, they'd be best mates, they would talk a lot. There's also another guy who was a senior officer in Special Operations Command at the time that I was there, who was a former soldier. That doesn't mean much to most people, but he was a former corporal or private in the SAS, made good, made bad maybe, depending on how you look at it. Now, he would have been very clued in to the whispers. So people knew. Now, Hurley tries to maintain that nobody at that very senior level ever passed the information on. Now, it may have just been gossip, that's fine. But if Hurley, he would have heard the gossip, he should have started an investigation. Now, one thing is certain, there was no investigation into Ben Roberts-Smith in 2012, 2013.
Given the actions by all of you during 2013 through 2015, it could be very easily demonstrated from our civilian point of view that they were fully informed of their administrative standing under those Hague and Geneva Conventions by not only a judicial process, but by all of you as a people united in a federal commonwealth who constantly pestered not only Christian Porter, but Scott Morrison's office over the years. This would mean that they were fully aware of their obligations in this theatre, obligations that include some really harsh laws that could be considered the poison chalice that they indeed sipped from.
Even though the allegations and whispers were there. Okay, maybe they didn't know. But there's a whole lot of other strange stuff happened in 2013. One, they started investigating anything, and sometimes they were quite ridiculous. We had one incident, I think Hastie was involved in this, where they called a helicopter gunship. The Australians called a helicopter gunship manned by the US to fire on a target. The target that the SAS had called out was a legitimate target. The US pilot of the Apache was confused about the grid reference and he shot a different target. The SAS people called it off as soon as they saw the machine gun rounds, the rocket rounds going into the wrong spot. They reported it, which was very good of them. They could have easily just pretended it never happened. They reported it knowing that there'd be a shitstorm. And you know what? This is in Hurley's time. And this is when they hadn't done a single investigation into now what we know, credible allegations of 30 murders. They investigated that as a murder. This is in 2013. Now, how could that be a murder? If anything, it was the Apache pilot, who's a US citizen. It couldn't have possibly been a murder from the SAS's point of view because they gave the right target and the helicopter pilot shot the wrong target. That was established immediately because they had records of all of this. And yet Hurley's leadership investigated that SAS guy as if he was a murderer. It didn't stop there. Later on that year, there was a huge scandal from someone having his hand cut off, a dead Taliban having his hand cut off. Now, the minister at the time, Stephen Smith, made a statement and said, David Hurley is appalled by this, as am I, but he said Hurley, and Hurley didn't contradict. And they treated that as if it was the worst thing that ever happened. And this is after the 30, probably 40 murders. Cutting off the hand of a dead Taliban was the worst thing they'd ever heard of. That's my dog. Suddenly got thirsty.
Let's forget about the command that they put into the states, and let's forget about the militarized presence in front of a land forces expo where they sold all of these corporate weapons. Let's forget about the Shrine of Remembrance in the King's Domain and all of the rubber bullets and non-lethal weapons in use. Let's forget about the sound weapons. Let's forget about the big speakers warning of this impending Romanized style force. Let's forget about all of the oppression from a state parliament that pushed some sort of poison across the states on behalf of some sort of linked machine here. And let's not forget that we're talking about recruitment and their inability to recruit anything because they've shown who they are and they've shown their face. And nobody wants to work for a bank that goes into other countries to pay off debts. No one wants to work for some sort of machine that crunches numbers at the expense of the very health of the people in its country. This is where a balance is coming in, a change of mindset, in that people recognize what they serve and people recognize the dangers of actually serving it.
It didn't stop there. In September of 2013, an SAS soldier was jumped by a Taliban person they were trying to take back to the base, and we reported it. There was nothing suspicious about it. They had a fight over the weapon, the SAS's weapon. The Taliban guy, and he was Taliban, was shot dead. There was a witness. Regrettable incident. Look into it by any means. Have better skills for taking off the cuffs for bringing Taliban back to the base. It was quite hard because we were working hand in hand with the Afghans, which meant our guys had to look over their shoulders to make sure they didn't get shot in the back. Guess what? Again, we didn't investigate Ben Robert Smith's patrol, not once, but we investigated this guy with a vengeance to try to put him in jail for murder. And that was when I was over there. And that's actually what first started me to say, hang on, because it didn't even meet the parameters of investigations for murders, but they still wanted to do it. And I questioned it, and they wanted to charge me. And that's where my journey began, to say, why did everything change in 2013? They also changed the rules of engagement. They also started throwing around things like, you could be guilty of murder if you follow the rules of engagement. And that wasn't true.
Interesting date. You could be guilty of murder if you follow the laws of armed conflict because something changed in the international game and they recognise something because it was put before them, or is something else going on? It's hard to tell.
But it looks like they were trying to scare anyone else who thought they were going to try and do what Ben Roberts-Smith had done. There's a lot of suspicious circumstances to say they knew in 2013. Now, maybe what they thought they were going to do, and Jeff Sengelman, who was a very clever guy, may have thought up this plan to say, OK, we're still in Afghanistan. If we investigate our most famous soldier while we're still in Afghanistan, there'll be a significant blowback and the Americans won't like it. The Americans probably said, don't do it. Fine, I get that from a management point of view. And I get you kick it down the road and you suddenly say, oh, we didn't know, but Samantha Crumfeltz, again, very suspiciously, they ordered a sociologist to do a study of unit culture, not war crimes, culture. And part of that study, and they sent people to Crumfeltz, so they knew who was going to speak to her, and no one's ever been charged for speaking to her, so there was complete immunity. And out of that study, this is 3 years later, they suddenly find out war crimes, even though Hastie, who's obviously an honest and honourable guy, and he's from the coalition, God, he said people knew in 2012 and 2013, probably before that.
And probably before that. Might have something to do with working for the Northern Territory and discovering some things about a oil silo and some land titles and how this all unwinds to become, which would lead to pestering a government because you could foreshadow something big was on the horizon that might affect everybody in the West, the debt, the West.
Another thing that comes from the defamation trial is that Ben Roberts-Smith was not on the top of the shortlist for the VC after the Battle of Tizak in 2009. He was elevated, and someone who was fighting shoulder to shoulder with him was totally missed out. Now that's strange. Again, going back to 2006, Ben Roberts-Smith was the first SAS person, I think, who was allowed to give a press conference talking about his brave deeds. Now, he's a very good talker, he's a good-looking guy. It looks like the government were using him because he was such a kind of Ken doll and such a good advertisement. They used him again for the VC, fantastic advertisement for the war. And then when they worked out their mistake, they didn't want to blame him because they would come down, or he would bring a lot of people down with him. So they looked for scapegoats, and 3 years later, 4 years later, it gradually comes out slowly, like letting the pressure out of a pressure cooker. Hurley has got a lot of questions to answer, and the fact that he turned a blind eye to what the Prime Minister did and just signed it, to me, is potentially evidence that he's the sort of guy who, by justifying it by saying, oh, I'm just doing what the government of the day wants, will bend the rules. He won't be Governor-General when I'm on trial. I'm going to call him as a witness. The government will fight him coming as a witness. But I would like my supporters to say to Anthony Albanese and Mark Dreyfus, he has to come as a witness. Tell his side of the story. Did he know? Because if he did know, and if it was all a cover-up after 2013, and it was all sham prosecutions of non-entities in order to make themselves look good, and smoke screens like the Jedi Council and the hand incident and other investigations which were never going to go anywhere. No one was charged with any of those incidents, or no one was ever put on trial with any of the incidents in 2013 which were apparently the worst. And yet no one was investigated for 2012. There's no statute of limitations. They could have done it. Hurley's credibility is important to my case. I think it matters that we have people who have honour and integrity and put the country first in positions like that, whether they're Chief of Defence Force or the Governor-General.
So, one never questions why the Hague and the Geneva Conventions apply in the very first, and why all these rules would be on the table, and what was presented to this government to define it in its administrative position that would make it so obligated to these very rules. And that might be the pressure of an Australian crown and the lineage of those Anzac and men on the outside impressing on all of you to send letters continuously to the Attorney General, the Prime Minister's office, the Solicitor General's office, and so forth. You pestered Pauline Hanson, you pestered Jackie Lambie, you pestered multiple politicians within this parliamentary body politic. Some of them listened, as you can see through your own past. Others did not and carried on with their war machine, only to walk full force into the rules and sip on that poison chalice. And that's the unfortunate predicament that brings us to today, where nobody wants to serve that poison.
Countries rising in the international system.
There is a club, the BRICS. Why this club? And do you consider that the BRICS will expand?
Well, to be honest, why the club? Because there was another club. It was called the G7, and you wouldn't let anybody else into that club. So we said we go and form our own club. So we decided, okay, we are also, good citizens of good standing who have a place in the global society, and therefore this is how typically clubs multiply. So it started, and as it started, like many clubs, it gained a life of its own. Over a period of time, others saw value in it as well. So in a sense, I would say, it's actually a very interesting group.
So I don't see any sort of naked owner to the Constitution that has that lineage coming to this half-guard to welcome a general of some other force in front of the government of the day. It becomes an issue when you have a command responsibility problem that needs to be addressed by the military police. So when we look at that in Australia, we look at this joint capabilities. We look at their responsibilities under the Brereton Report, which makes them obligated to investigate all war crimes and bring them to trial. This includes command responsibility. This includes the international humanitarian law under Rule 92. This includes all these things that we have discussed in the previous videos. On a civilian level, this is handled by the Australian Federal Police. So it should be suggested to you that you go through a civil claim and submit it to the Australian Federal Police as evidence in those war crimes. This could be as simple as revenue raising off you in an incident of human trafficking where they have used you as sweat labour for the state, used you as sweat labour for the state. This is indicative of any trafficking notice that may have been issued to you by any state police force. All of these things are technically war crimes. The crime of slavery and human trafficking is a very real one. And when we look at what we discuss here in this video, the repercussions for carrying out these offences are very real as well when we look at history and the words defining a cup and poison therein.
Because your incentive that they're giving them, this is their first mistake. They're offering $50,000 for those who have done their 4 years to stay in. What they didn't incentivise is anything for those that are senior corporals and sergeants within the military to keep them in, because we need them for mentoring. So guess what? This is what's happened out of the 2,000 people that they've asked. They've had about 800 that have taken up on that 50 grand, and you've had about 1,200 that have said, no, thank you, I won't be around in 3 years' time. So that's your first problem, is first of all, you've given a kick in the backside to the people, the backbone of the military, which are your senior corporals and your sergeants, and offered them nothing to stay in and mentor. And I think your other problem is we've seen what senior commanders do with their troops. I mean, that's why we're at a Royal Commission. They throw them under the bus. So you've got two distinctive problems there. First of all, you're not offering those people who should be offered money and incentives to stay. You've offered them nothing on the table. And secondly, we have seen through the war crimes, the Royal Commission, that senior command will not take any responsibility for their own actions or lack of. And that is a massive problem, and that is what you're seeing play out there in Australia. And you've got people out there saying, just don't join until it's fixed. Well, I don't know what you want me to do about that, but seriously, that's where we're at.
And this is the fracture. We have soldiers that know they serve the people and not the government, and we have a government telling them that they serve the government of the day. This takes away from what they are, and no one can take that from them. They earned it, and it's their duty. And that's a lifelong duty that no one is going to taint. They know who they are, while their countrymen are abused all the time in an international system wherein they see their foundations and see their lineage and can define their ancestry to know who they are. And when we talk about recruitment and the lack thereof, it is because of this collection that is taking place and the way the people are treated in this financial machine that goes against the foundations in that Constitution, which gave the people that freedom that we speak of. It is in those laws themselves that gave you the right to be free and have those liberties with God, to only have them trampled on, while men still remember that they fight for a people and not the government of the day.